Now, this last portion is going to talk about learning and memory. So how is it that things that we learn today, our brains have the ability to consolidate it into permanent storage that we know as memory? So learning is the acquisition and storage of information, and it's due to the best way to get to learn things would be as a consequence of experience. And that is why part of the learning process, there are internships and hands-on experiences. Those are the best way to learn. While memory would be putting what we learned into that permanent storage form in the brain. Now, there are two different kinds of memories. Okay, we kind of divide them into these broad categories. And those are declarative memory and procedural memory. So declarative memory means that I am able to tell you a story of what happened of any of my experiences. So I can recall conscious experiences, declare them, hence the name declarative memory, and sometimes also referred to as explicit memory. And again, that is the ability to tell you, I did this yesterday, this is what happened, and so on. So it's kind of like a storytelling kind of memory. The parts that are involved are your hippocampus and amygdala. Remember, another thing that the amygdala was involved in was fear. So you see that different parts, parts can be involved in more than one thing at a time. Okay, so the hippocampus and amygdala are needed in order to form these declarative memories. Now, procedural memory is how you remember how to do things. So how to ride a bike, how to drive a car. So these are what we do for skilled behavior. Okay, and we also use procedural memory in learning things that lead to emotional responses. Like, for example, fear of spiders. Okay, that is a procedure that we have learned. It's a learned skill, so to speak. Another classic example is Pavlov's dogs. So if you're not familiar with that experiment, please go ahead and research it. So that again is where we learn these skills under the type of memory known as a procedural memory. The parts of the brain that are involved are your sensory motor cortex, basal nuclei, and the cerebellum. Now, if you categorize memory according to short and long term, that's a different categorization. So in terms of duration, like how long ago did this incident or this skill occur? So that would be short-term versus long-term memory. So short-term memory, that is registers and retains information for only a short period of time, sometimes seconds to minutes after it happens. And if short-term memory is not converted into long-term memories, we are going to lose those short-term ones. So we obviously go through different things throughout the day, but at the end of the day, you really don't remember all of the small details. So those small details that are irrelevant, of no significant importance, remain in the short-term memory for a while, and then they are deleted. But the ones that are important are going to get consolidated into long-term memories. Now, how do we do that? Consolidation of short into long-term memories happens due to the increase in the branching of the dendrites, increase in the amount of neurotransmitters that are being released. So there's a lot more involved than just an event happening and keeping it in somewhere in the brain for a short period of time. So in long term, you have literally changed the structure of the neurons. Okay, again, you've maybe developed new dendrites, developed new connections with other neurons, increase the amount of neurotransmitters. So when you say that things have been engraved into our brains, that is almost right. Okay, so we did make structural changes to our neurons. And that again is known as consolidation of short-term memories into long-term ones. And that takes some time. Okay, so it's not something that can happen, over minutes. Okay, that consolidation takes time, it takes repetition, and so on. And that's what we try to do when we go from learning, listening to these lectures. That would be short-term memory. But when you get to a point where the stuff comes to you automatically, you're able to retain the information and maybe even explain it to others. That's how now you've increased the number of your dendrites, increased the connections between the brain cells, increased your neurotransmitters. You've consolidated that information now into your long-term memory. Now, the different parts of the brain that are involved in these different kinds of memory are very different from short-term versus long-term, procedural versus declarative, and we'll go over those. Okay, short-term memory, again, is very susceptible to external interference, meaning, so let's say, for example, you're going home from work and you need to remember to go get some milk on your way back home, or go get some gas, fill up the tank on your way back home. That would be in your short-term memory. Okay, you keep on constantly reminding yourself as you're going home that you need to do this, or you have an alarm to remind you. Because again, it's in your short-term memory and it's very easy to forget about it. And that is true, because if anything happens on the outside, so if there's any kind of external interference, let's say you get called into this emergency meeting, or you there's an accident on the way back home. Okay, all of these, any kind of external interference will actually make you forget to get that gas or to pass by the grocery store to get that milk. So short-term memory is very susceptible to external interference. It's easy to delete, so to speak. Okay, and on the other hand, long-term memory, though, can survive these external interferences. It can even survive deep anesthesia. So when a patient gets surgery done, they go through anesthesia, they wake up, their long-term memories are the same. They have not changed. Long-term memories can even survive electroconvulsive therapy. Okay, so these deep anesthesia and ECT would affect short-term, but not long-term memories. Now, what parts of the brain do we use for each? So declarative memory, and that again is declaring a story, retelling stories from the past. Short-term declarative memory, so let's say you asked me what I had for breakfast this morning. Okay, that would be short-term memory. That would remain in the hippocampus and other parts of the limbic system. But if you asked me a year later what I had for breakfast, provided that I actually remember, that would be considered now long-term memory, and that would, many areas of the cortex are involved in that. So let's take something else besides breakfast, because that's very, insignificant thing to remember down the road. But let us say I went to this great place, I had a really nice time. I can tell you what happened short-term. I have these short-term memories in the hippocampus. If you ask me about the restaurant or the event, and a year later, I can still declare it as a memory. I can still retell the story, but at this time, it's not the hippocampus. Well, hippocampus now and other association cortex areas are involved in that long-term declarative memory. Now it comes to procedural memory. Okay, short-term, there are lots of different areas. So when I'm trying to learn how to drive a car, okay, so I've got my vision, my hearing, my motor skills, all of these are involved, all widely distributed throughout the brain in order to remember short-term how to drive. As it gets engraved and becomes part, pretty much a reflex or automatic, where we now can drive the car without having to actively think about the next step, these procedural long-term memories are engraved now in the basal nuclei, in the cerebellum, and in the sensory motor cortex. So again, what is the kind of nervous or neural basis of learning and memory? So short-term memory needs graded or action potentials that are ongoing. So continuously, reminding yourself that you have to go get gas, okay? Putting maybe several reminders, several alarms to keep that short-term memory going. Once you stop that alarm from going off, short-term memory can be very easily forgotten. It could be totally erased. Short-term memory can be interrupted if somebody loses consciousness. So let's say somebody's crossing the street and they get hit by a car. And then you ask the patient what happened. They will tell you they have no idea. Okay, because that memory of crossing the street really didn't have time to process from a short-term to a long-term memory. So they really do not remember crossing the street and getting hit by the car. They will tell you that there was a blow. Okay, they did get hit, but they have no memories whatsoever of what happened before getting hit. That is known as retrograde amnesia. So amnesia, it means the loss of memory. Anterograde amnesia, that would happen due to damage in the limbic system and associated structures like the hippocampus, thalamus, and hypothalamus. And that means the patient has totally lost the ability to consolidate any short-term memories into long-term memories. So this would be a patient that would meet you, ask you your name. 5 minutes later, they would ask you your name again. 5 minutes down the road from then, they will ask your name again. So they have no ability of changing that short-term memory of knowing your name into a long-term memory where 5 or 10 minutes down the road, they are able to recall what your name was. So that again is the loss of the ability to consolidate short-term declarative memories into long-term memories. And there is a very famous patient, HM, those are his initials. And you guys can watch kind of like his, I believe it's his grandson that is retelling the story. And the patient had anterograde amnesia, where they do not have that ability to consolidate anything short-term into long-term. Now, the term long-term potentiation means where short-term memory becomes a long-term memory. And we kind of already discussed how that happens, where the neurons are going to increase the number of dendrites, increase the connections with other neurons in other parts of the brain, increase the amount of neurotransmitters, the amount of receptors. All of these structural and anatomical changes that are happening to the neurons are literally engraving these memories into the brain. There's a lot of DNA activation, protein synthesis. So you see there's a lot of, you need more time in order for short-term to become a long-term memory. So you want to be very patient when you're studying, thinking, well, I can never remember this. Well, your brain needs time in order to make those dendrites and make those connections, to synthesize the protein and activate the DNA. It's a matter of going over the material once and twice and 3 times and so on in order to engrave it into the brain. Okay, that ability to make these connections and to change the structure of the neurons is known as plasticity. Plasticity is at its highest in young kids. So it's easier for younger kids to learn new things and new skills as opposed to adults learning new things and new skills. And obviously plasticity tends to decrease as we age. Now for cerebral dominance and language. So we have 2 cerebral hemispheres, a right and a left. Okay, they are symmetrical, okay, whether anatomically speaking but function-wise though, there are some differences. So 90% of the population, the dominant hemisphere is the left. Okay, it does not really have a lot to do with whether you're right-handed or left-handed, as most people think. Okay, research shows it has a little bit to do, but not as much as we think. So most of us have a dominant hemisphere of the left side. And that's where we are able to comprehend and produce language. So they're different. They're two different centers for language. One center to comprehend or to understand language, and another center to produce language, to figure out how am I going to put the sentence together in order to say these words or to express my thoughts. Okay. And language is a very complex thing to happen because it involves reading, so it involves vision, it involves being hearing, so you can hear language. It also involves, obviously, the muscles of speech. Okay, so the muscles of the tongue, the pharyngeal and the laryngeal muscles. It also involves the expression muscles, so your facial expressions, even sometimes using gestures and so on. The major centers that we have for speech are found usually on the left side. So they are going to be found on the dominant hemisphere, and as we kind of agreed that 90% of the population has the dominant hemisphere on the left side. So we're going to be kind of discussing this in that term. So these are going to be found in the left hemisphere, and it takes about 3 different lobes. Okay, so the motor part, or the motor known as Broca's center, is found in the frontal cortex, while the sensory center that is known as Wernicke's center is found in the temporal and parietal cortex. So very close to the Sylvian fissure. So if you're not sure what the Sylvian fissure is, I want to just go to this picture. I'll go back to those 2 slides. So this right here is Sylvian's fissure, and it is the fissure that separates the temporal lobe on the bottom from the parietal and frontal lobe above it. Now this right here is Broca's area. That is the motor area where if I need to say a sentence, Broca's area will tell me how to move the tongue, my pharyngeal muscles, laryngeal muscles, and so on in order to speak my thoughts. Okay, so Broca's area is the motor area of speech. While Wernicke's area, that's the sensory area of speech, meaning that it helps me understand speech. It helps me understand what I'm reading or hearing. That is known as the sensory area. And you can see here that it is found in the temporal and parietal lobes of the dominant hemisphere. Now, what happens if those are damaged? So we'll take a look at that, and I'm going back to the slides that I kind of skipped over to show you that image. That males and females, there are gender differences when it comes to language. Okay, so females tend to use both cerebral hemispheres in order to understand and comprehend and use different language tasks, while males generally show activity mainly on the dominant side. And patients who suffer from brain damage that can lead to loss or defects in their language and in their ability to communicate, and that would be known as aphasia. So aphasia means speechlessness, or aprosodia. Prosody is the different things that we do while we're talking. So facial expressions, gestures with our hands, or different pitches. So kind of emphasizing different parts of the words or different parts of the sentence. All of that is known as prosody. The loss of these abilities is known as aprosodia. Okay, so brain damage can either lead to aphasia or aprosodia or both. So we'll talk about the different kinds of aphasias. We talked already about Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area is the sensory part of language. It helps us comprehend or understand whether we're listening to that language or reading the language. So if that area is damaged, that will lead to what is known as sensory aphasia. Okay, so let's kind of see, how do we develop Wernicke's area? When babies are born, okay, they do not have those areas, obviously. They can hear, but not understand what is being told to them. But then as the days and the months go by, they now can hear and start to comprehend, very simple words. That is because they are developing their Wernicke's area. Okay, so they are now starting to comprehend the language that is being spoken to them. If you are learning one or more language, okay, your Wernicke's area would have to develop the software or download the software for the different languages that you're learning. And that is why if you're in a bilingual household, it takes a little bit of a time in order to download both of those softwares. So a lot of the times you'll find these kids that are speaking a little bit later than they should. But when they do, they don't stop talking. Okay, no. But when they do, they now have the ability to speak both of those languages. So they have, again, downloaded the software for both of those languages. And the place where the software needs to be downloaded is known as Wernicke's area. What happens if that area is damaged? That would lead to what is known as sensory aphasia. So the person does not lose the ability to talk, okay, but what they are saying makes no sense. They can still hear, but what they're hearing makes no sense. So they have lost that comprehension part of language. Patients are usually not aware that there is a problem. So they will be talking to you thinking that everything is perfectly fine, but you cannot understand what they're saying. So there's a little video showing that this reporter was on the air and then she got an attack of sensory aphasia. And I want you to see what it looked like. In contrast to that, damage to Broca's area, remember Broca's area is the motor part of language that sends the signals to your muscles of speech. If Broca's area is damaged, that is known as motor or expressive aphasia, where the patient is now fully aware that they cannot express themselves. It is very frustrating to the patient. So the patient can understand and they do want to talk, but they have no way of sending orders to the muscles of speech. And again, they are fully aware of the problem. That is why, again, they're very frustrated as opposed to sensory aphasic patients where they do not know, they're unaware that there's an issue. Here again, these are the two different areas that we talked about, so I'm going to go ahead and move on. There we go. So cerebral dominance and language, the potential for the development of language-specific mechanism starts at birth, and it starts in the left hemisphere. Meaning that, again, as the baby is born, we really do not have these centers developed yet. The left side, the dominant hemisphere, is usually the hemisphere that has the ability to develop them. But if there is anything wrong with that left side, and they're unable to develop the Wernicke's or Broca's area on there, the right side will definitely take over, okay? And that ability to switch cerebral dominance from left to right, that flexibility is found early in the earlier years of life. As we age, we kind of lose that flexibility. So let's say, a patient comes in, they're 70 or 80, they get a stroke, and now they have lost their Broca's area or they lost their Wernicke's area. Now they need to go back to train, and we're talking about here, they've lost those areas on the left hemisphere. They want to regain the function of Broca's or Wernicke's. They would have to train the right hemisphere to use them, the ones that have not been used for all those years. And that is what a speech therapist does. The speech therapist teaches the patient how to start developing the unused areas that were on the non-dominant hemisphere in order to be able to regain some of their expressive or some of their language functions. We do know, though, from split brain experiments, and a split brain experiments mean that we literally split the brain and figured out what works on one side and what stuff works on the other side. What split brain experiments have demonstrated that the left hemisphere does in fact have a language center that sometimes might not actually be in the right hemisphere. So sometimes even going through speech therapy could be kind of hard because the right side might not even have the ability to make or to create that language center. Here you can see we're kind of gathering or looking at the activity of the different parts of the brain as while communicating with the patient. So if the patient is reading or seeing words, you can see here that obviously the occipital lobe is the one that is active. So the more active areas are going to be either red or yellow. Hearing words, we've got the temporal lobe that is active, and that all makes sense because these are the auditory, that's where the auditory cortex is. Generating words, okay, so the patient is going to start making words. That would be Broca's area in the frontal lobe. Now speaking the words would be again in the frontal lobe in that precentral gyrus. So I hope you enjoyed this chapter. This chapter is actually one of the chapters that I really enjoy. I hope you enjoyed it too. And let me know if you have any questions.